we've brought up two additional folks. Unfortunately, some of our folks had to leave due to other commitments. But I'd like to introduce, first off, our two latest panelists. And unfortunately, one of our panelists who was here to speak about actual transportation and the light rail and the red line, et cetera, was unable to attend last minute because of an emergency. So, however, we have two lovely gentlemen who have joined us. To my left is Michael Stanton, who was educated at Antioch College and Harvard and received his Master's of Architecture from Princeton. Most recently, he's taught at the University of Maryland and the Maryland Institute College of Art, and he's currently directing a design institute, and I'm going to mispronounce that, Aula PFC?
Aula PFC.
Aula PFC at the Polytechnic University in Madrid, Spain. So, Michael, welcome. And on my right is Dominic Wiker, who's an experienced development professional with over 15 years in managing large-scale development projects. He's currently overseeing the $30 million redevelopment of the 250,000 square foot historic Hochul Cone warehouse in Baltimore's Mount Vernon neighborhood, where he'll be converting those into 171 market rate apartments. Dominic received a bachelor's from Johns Hopkins and a master's degree from Carnegie Mellon. So, gentlemen, welcome. Both of these men are going to have a chance to just give a quick 3 to 5 overview of what they've been up to over the years and what they're working on now. So, Michael, for those of you who can see, to your left over there is the screen, and Michael's got a couple of slides for you.
Thank you, and congratulations on either accidentally or intentionally finding a German room for this, even with the German flag over here, and so it's all very appropriate. I put up the map of Baltimore because the map indicates different economic sections of the city. And one thing you find, which is fairly typical in southern American cities, especially in New Orleans, where I've spent most of my life, is that you find poverty and wealth living side by side. And so the red and yellow often bump into each other here. Famous moments like Greenmount Avenue with Guilford on one side and Waverly on the other, and so on. But also notice that Howard Street is one of those spots where the yellow apparently indicating the Mount Vernon area and the red, West Baltimore, collide there. And of course, this is one of the issues that pertains to the problems that we're talking about today, and maybe some solutions. Baltimore was the second largest city in the United States from 1830 to 1850, which is an important fact because we understand then the fabric. By 1960, it was number 6, and now, having lost 40% of its population, it's now number 18, behind Jacksonville, Florida, and Austin, Texas. And this is, of course, another fact which is very implicit in what we're talking about today, the fact that it is a kind of an empty city, and thus a city with a lot of potential. Now, I'm probably one of the few people in this room who's old enough to remember Howard Street as it was. And it was really the Cardo and Decumanes of Baltimore, or the Cardo of Baltimore, and the Decumanes was Lexington Avenue. It was the center, the vital center. This photograph is from about 1900. And Uli, you will notice that the street is much wider and the sidewalks less wide. We were talking about this yesterday, the problem of enormous sidewalks and very little space for automobile and light rail movement on Howard Street. And sure enough, there was much less sidewalk. In fact, it almost seems as if sidewalk and street, we can see that jaywalking was already a big and popular activity in Baltimore even back then. This must be the 1940s. A little further south, we see Lexington Corner there, and we see the Reed's Drugstore. And Baltimoreans have this funny mixture of kind of arrogance and self-deprecation. They like to believe that the civil rights movement started in Baltimore with the sit-ins that Morgan State students participated in 1955 at Reed's. It's a monument to the civil rights movement for sure. And Maryland was one of the most important states in the civil rights struggle, as we know. But you can see still, of course, the vital activity of Howard Street. And by the 1960s, this is 1961, you know it from the float, the interesting fact about the segregated southern city that Baltimore was at this point, this was just the beginning of the civil rights struggle here, was that this area, the crossing of Howard and Lexington, was an extraordinarily integrated and vital kind of mixing of all the peoples of Baltimore. They came together. There was very little fear of crime or the wrong people or whatever that was talked about in the first session. And therefore, all communities gathered at this point, and it was a place where that kind of sort of mixing of social classes, wealth, poverty, race, and so on, had kind of a wonderful result in that proximity. One of the monuments of Baltimore Street, the Provident Bank, an extraordinary building, built as a bank in the 19th century, based on, come on, here we go, based on the Barrière Bonhomme by Jean-Claude Nicolas Ledoux from 1787, 2 years before the French Revolution. Many of the barrières built by, of course, by Louis XVI, Ancien Regime buildings for sure, taxing houses for people entering Paris, were burned down and destroyed, like the Bastille was during the French Revolution. This one survived to a certain point and then was destroyed. And our bank has some of the same sort of notion of an Ancien Regime object. The banks themselves, which are, of course, stand for systems of great questionability in this society, and it now has become a mosque. And the mosque itself, of course, represents a faith which accommodates some of our oldest citizens and our newest immigrants simultaneously, and thus speaks of change and continuity in this very, very interesting and problematic city.
And next we're going to have Dominic just give us a quick overview of the projects he's worked on to date and what he's working on right now.
Sure, thanks. I'm working right now on the restoration of the old Hochul warehouse at Park and Center. It's as Nan mentioned before, it's about a 250,000 square foot building, 6-story building, dates back to 1942. We'll be converting that to 171 market rate rental apartments with about 18,000 square feet of ground floor retail in the old furniture showroom and along the south side of the building. Delivery is expected for June 1st of 2014, so construction is actively underway. It is a historic project from the Department of Interior standards, so we're receiving federal tax credits from the city. We're also receiving the new office conversion property tax credit. So both of those have been, really instrumental in kind of propelling our project along. Our architects right now are Marks Thomas, Kinsley Construction is the GC, and by all accounts, it's going very well. As Charlie had mentioned in kind of an earlier remarks, we really do see this project as an extension kind of Mount Vernon southward into the downtown West Side area. We also see it as a bridge really between Mount Vernon and the Cultural District and Seton Hill. And I think it's a very very important location for an active user. And really we're very committed to trying to bring a retail user kind of worthy of that location right now. So that's sort of it.
So this is kind of a much more open conversation amongst all of the panelists here. So please, at any point, anybody jump in. I won't necessarily pick on anyone specifically. I think there's been a lot of conversation today, obviously, about residential, and that's certainly something that is part of the Downtown Partnership Strategic Plan. It's obviously one of the mayor's goals is to continue to grow the city with new households. And as we look at the plethora, shall we say, of city-owned properties on the west side and in the Bromo district along the Howard Street corridor, but certainly through the district as well. And we have a new opportunity with the area formerly known as the Superblock or Lexington Square development. One of the questions that's come up amongst a variety of folks, and certainly people within this room and on this panel, is the best way to develop really to look at the mega project, a large scale project, or is it better to really look at individual properties? So that's kind of question number one, or portion number one of this is there a linchpin development, or is it really about just kind of going building by building? And the other portion of this question would be, how can the city, as the owner and controller of these properties, really best and most efficiently dispose of these properties and make them an asset for private development and not be the ones necessarily leading the charge of that development. So I'll kind of throw that out there, and certainly to our Hamburg colleagues, any experiences that you all have with your two projects and what you learned with those. So please jump in at any time.
I will try in the first place because we have been thinking about these issues very much in detail and strategically. What we are trying to do is, in order to create sufficient diversity in the city, to segment markets, I would say, and to relate that to smaller areas. So think big in terms of strategy, but think small in terms of individual projects. So when you have major sites, the consequence would be, if there is a critical mass and economies of scale to be generated to bring together different types of developers from the city side, in my view, and we did this on several occasions, where the developers have different types of knowledge, competencies, and different aspirations, and generate, so to say, a more holistic approach from different private perspectives in one location, if one thinks one can attempt a higher degree of diversity. And the experience has been in HafenCity that that can be achieved, although the coordination is more difficult and requires an external coordination which is rather strong. I would also think that an important element would be if you, I would actually say, skip out of your wording the word of deposit or dispose of urban land. I would think the question is to generate an option in the transformation process which generates additional quality. And what we are doing is we are doing a public tender, sometimes requiring a very detailed framework of aspirations, and say this is our standard, and are not hoping for innovations but enforcing it to a certain degree, and then also generating an option for a year and 1.5 in which there is an architectural competition, a land sales contract is designed, financing can be obtained, and so on. So it's a cooperation process between city agency and the individual developer. And if the individual development is not performed, I simply send a letter, thank you for your cooperation, I'm taking the land back. That is working because the sites are not too big, and at all points in time there is a sufficient competitive environment because the projects do not become that big. So that has been a strategic approach, and that has been perceived very favorable also by the developers, because we, on the other side, provide infrastructure, security that we do it the same way with all the sites, and generate a higher quality which in the whole urban environment, which allows the value of the land to increase. So Wendy's project is very much at risk because it is a standalone project. If there would be, so to say, an environment of 3 other projects in the space, then there would be a potential that the value of her property development would be far greater, and there would be a higher degree of security for all the developers in place. So that has been appreciated very much. So small or big is, so to say, in my view, the wrong dichotomy at which to operate. The different scales you have to play with, the different actors to be brought in to generate a competitive, innovative market, and that is possible under all conditions, I would say.
I certainly don't want to speak for the development community, but I mean, I think anything that would promote sort of speed and openness would be welcomed. Rather than having properties sort of sit tied up in a longer public process for kind of on an indefinite basis, while the rest of the community kind of goes by and time just gets wasted. I mean, I think the notion of something, that was time limited and said, you need to either put up, get your financing in order, get your design in order, and or move on for the next person. I think that would be eminently fair and eminently reasonable, particularly in an area like West Side that has had so many sort of fits and starts and false promises kind of made and believed in. So that would just be my comment. I don't know, Wendy, if you have any thoughts there.
I mean, I like this whole idea of the public sector really kind of acting as the master developer in a sense, and bringing the public open spaces and the infrastructure and even some of the financing to the table. And then yes, you look at projects on either a building by building basis or a smaller block by block basis, but certainly to not have the mega projects where if it doesn't work, we're all in trouble.
Yes, I agree. I wouldn't say as well, it is not a matter of spatial dimension. I would say it is, the question is, what is driving as an incubator the best? And what would be the appropriate incubator now to bring the area in the consciousness of the whole city, in the consciousness of potential clients, of people who are looking for a house or an apartment? What could make the area attractive? And what are the main issues we have to tackle in this? And this can be a spatial problem, but that must not be necessarily a spatial problem. So you have to identify what are the major challenges and what should we tackle at first, and then perhaps it is a combination between some software approaches with hardware approaches. Perhaps it's a little bit concerning open space. It's concerning real or perceived security questions or whatever. But I don't know that, because if you make a walk around, you can't have a recipe. But I think it is not primarily a question of spatial dimension.
To address this question in a slightly different point of view, when I was invited to be on this panel, I wondered, what does the wealthiest city in Europe, situated in a social democracy, have to do? How can we actually frame issues and questions in comparison to that city here in Baltimore? And I've realized now, having spent a day with the gentleman here and having spent actually quite a bit of time in Hamburg as well, that the interesting thing are the glaring differences in the way people look at what they can do here. It's an issue of agency. It's an issue of how we go about implementing these things. And I was with them yesterday, and there was a parking lot, and they said, well, we would just have a competition, and then we would come up with a project, and that project would be presented to a developer, and the developer would be told, you have to do this, and they would do it. And I think, my God, what a radical concept that we could do that. And first of all, have a competition. Second of all, tell the developer what to do, and and so on. And obviously pump in an enormous amount of public money and activity. I don't know if we know this, but the big housing agencies in Northern Europe, in Netherlands, and in Germany are NGOs. They're public, private, nonprofit organizations, which then support all kinds of things. They supported a workshop that I did in Beirut, and so on. So they are benevolent organizations. Not to say all developers are malevolent, sorry to say that, but they're definitely benevolent organizations. So agency, how do you go about doing this stuff is it seems to me the first step, rather than discussing spatial issues, as you said, or issues of how much green space, how much narrowing streets, and so on. These things all become only possible if one judges by this kind of data. We need to actually look at the way things are done, and of course, that will be a very cynical and sad process, because it's hard to imagine that we could implement things this way, but perhaps we can move our processes and activities toward that kind of implementation. And then these sort of questions could be answered, with more authority. Authority, that's the point, authority.
Are there any project financing vehicles? Certainly, Dominic and Wendy both mentioned some of the incentives that they've used, but are there certain options for financing, public and private, that do kind of translate well across oceans and continents, or recommendations from the panel, as well as recommendations from our Hamburg panelists, as well as those here who have utilized what we do have available here in Baltimore City and or in the United States that really seem to work best. And I'm going to put the caveat on that, of course, that infrastructure dollars and dollars in Baltimore are stretched very thin across a very needy city, and a lot of different both social capacity as well as physical infrastructure. So knowing that there is limited, city dollar available, how do we really address some of those issues? Sorry, that's a loaded question. So.
I would point out those dollars are spent differently also. We do have.
I will try a first start again. I think there is no easy way to transfer the experience in terms of financing structures from Hamburg to Baltimore. That's not because Hamburg is a rich city and Baltimore is a poor one, or to put it differently. The issue is that the institutional setup and the system of financing development, how to deal with subsidies, with tax exemptions and so on, is completely different, and the financing of cities is also different. So we are based very much not on land tax so much, but on a mixture of taxation from residences, from companies, and a low proportion, for example, of land tax. So it provides completely different incentives and mechanisms, to say this in general. Saying that, I would think there are two comments I would like to make, maybe a little bit different than Uli would make them. I think when you have a major project, there is no choice you can make which allows you as a city or as a state to say, well, transfer all the obligations to the private sector in one way or the other. I think it is absolutely necessary that the state, the municipality, plays a decisive role in providing not only the welfare for people, but also the infrastructure which is necessary for the welfare and the growth of the city of the future. And that has been neglected. We have been, even in Europe, but I see this from a casual observation from the US, there has been not enough investment in the infrastructure for whatever reason, but that's the observation. And I think you cannot have comprehensive turnarounds in project areas like this if there is no sufficient commitment in terms of financing and in terms of manpower resources. Second point, I think naturally, resources are spread thinly under these conditions in a city. But I would think there are places which are important enough in order to merit a turnaround situation. And then it is a question of setting political financial priorities to achieve, in my view, a turnaround. There are other places in Hamburg which are poor, besides Wilhelmsburg, yeah. But the decisive point was that without an integrated, comprehensive approach among different perspectives, limited in time, maybe 10 years, 7 years, or in HafenCity it's a little bit longer, you have to commit resources to that area. And now we are thinking how to spill over these effects into neighboring areas from Iber and from HafenCity. So I think the western area in Baltimore is such an area where there must be a public financial and resource commitment beyond so to say, the average commitment of other areas for a certain time, and that is absolutely necessary to reach a tipping point in the, so to say, self-generating positive development of a city. And then you go to the next one after 10 years, or when you can afford 2 or 3 of those projects, make 2 or 3 projects at the same time. But you need this bias in financing in order to achieve progress.
I think if no one's counting on monies or resources coming from the city to incentivize some of these projects in the West Side area, but I think what would be enormously helpful would be if the state could figure out a way to tweak their historic tax credit program to allow greater flexibility for maybe such a priority area as the West Side really should be. I mean, it's just, the federal tax credit is just probably arguably one of the single greatest innovations that's ever come out of Washington. And I mean, it's a great program. It keeps our community stable. It keeps our design standards high, and it makes a lot of projects work. But the state program has an equal role in this, and the way it's been crafted over the last probably 10 years has really, I think, stymied further development in an area with as much historic fabric as Howard Street in the West Side. So I mean, I don't know how your project would have been, but our project, we needed the historic credits for sure.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that, and we use both the federal and state historic project to get St. James Place done. But I think we need to restore the state historic credit back to what it was, 10 years ago. But even in addition to that, I think that, the public sector also has to play a bigger role in, financing some of the infrastructure, and also helping with some of the smaller buildings that you're not going to get private investment to come in and redo. And maybe we have to set up some sort of organization that would help just the average user to try and recapture some of these smaller buildings. So, if you have a merchant who wants to open a shop on the ground level and live upstairs, I mean, how can that person get the project done? And maybe you bring in some outside developers. Of course, I have to put in a plug for developers to, help with that process, but it has to be something that the public sector is spearheading in order to get it accomplished.
And I think just to address that very quickly, kind of a follow-up question to this would be, one of the roles the Downtown Partnership plays, and to a certain extent some of the city agencies, is really working with the lenders, the banks, et cetera, that private developers work with. My question as a personal professional question would be, is the Downtown Partnership doing enough? Is the city doing enough to attract the private investment from the lending corporations, the REITs, et cetera? What should we all be doing as organizations to really help make it easier to promote the area and to promote the financing that needs to be there from the private banks and whatnot for your projects?
Yeah, I mean, one of the issues when you start talking about bank financing, I mean, banks are beginning to lend again, which is a good thing. For a while, they wouldn't even take your call. But, it's the bigger thing is the issue of guarantees. And I don't know if there's a way for the public sector to step in and maybe not provide the financing, but help to provide some of those guarantees, so in fact you could get the private sector to then come in and actually accomplish the project.
Sure. I mean, I think Downtown Partnership does a very good job as far as conveying market information to outside financing. Folks who aren't familiar with Baltimore and in the market. I mean, I think the partnership has positioned themselves well as a resource. I think at the same time, there's probably lack of clarity coming from the city agencies as to what the sort of the larger strategic goal is on the west side. And I think in a way, I think decisions like that, our company's making from the private sector are kind of filling that void, but there's only sort of so much that we can kind of do on the margins without kind of a larger, without a larger plan or without a larger direction coming from the city agencies.
Yeah. I'd like to talk about something. As representative of the academy, I suppose here I have to take a kind of critical position. And that is that the point of view of this panel, and also of almost every other urban agency I've had to deal with in teaching urban design and architecture for many years, is that whatever's going to happen is going to come from above. In other words, some kind of agency is going to come in, the state's going to be involved, somebody large and legislative and rich will be making the decisions that will change the city. And Baltimore is a clear example of that not happening, and that so much of what's happening in Baltimore now is almost below the radar, alternative. You asked it the squatting question. There are semi-squatted and very interesting phenomena occurring. One of them is the huge copycat building up off in Station North. This city is developing itself as a kind of alternative to conventional urban strategies and structures. And of course, we understand that means it's going to remain poor to a certain extent. It's going to remain marginal to a certain extent, and that is not good. But to encourage those agencies and to open up, and I'm talking, we know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about people who set up tiny software agencies or cafes, all of them kind of somewhere on the edge of legality. The area we're talking about is full of almost kind of squatted buildings full of artists and other people doing things. And they generate an enormous amount of energy. Probably most of the things that people who went to Station North, and to the question that was asked earlier, went to Station North or went to this area last month, went to something that was somehow outside of the structures that we've been talking about. And I think that needs to be encouraged, somehow legitimized, as the way it is in Europe, where squatters actually become active players in urban development and urban renewal. And I'm not just talking about squatting, I'm talking about other kind of grassroots, let's say grassroots activities that this city is now, both from indigenous communities where churches and civic agencies in those communities are doing all kinds of things in parks and in buildings and so on, and then the famous kind of fertilizer that seems to fall from the arts community. We talk about artists, they always are. Whenever you have an architectural project, implanting artists is like a fertilizer, that's going to make things happen and so on. And that, to a certain extent, that's true. And MICA does produce thousands of them, so they become then a kind of seeding crop of very excited, very interesting, and very innovative people. And encouraging them and seeing the city as possibly developing both from above and encouraging that other grassroots activity, which is so vital here and so exciting to me. It's what I find really interesting about this city, is what I think we could also talk about and is rarely talked about in these kind of symposia and so on.
Do you have any other comments?
Well, I would like to make a proposal. As far as I learned yesterday, a lot of buildings belong to the city. Take 10 of these buildings, bring them in a very repair them on a very low basis, so that people live in there. No heating, no nothing but installation, so that people can build bathrooms by themselves, kitchen by themselves, and can install heating. Give them a grant for solar thermal panels on the roof. And make a call of idea and say we have 10 basically repaired houses. We give a certain amount of money for innovative concept. Please acquire for, or please apply for and submit ideas what you would like to do. 10 or a dozen of houses. It costs you perhaps $1 million, let me say. So, and then wait what will happen. And there will be a countrywide debate about this proposal. There will be a media interest that sweeps to Europe and all over the world, and we pick it up and say, "Oh, that's a good idea."
And you told them to do it.
And you will see what happens. That it will be a hype for people, for young people, for creative people, for artists, for students, for young architects, for engineers who say, "Oh, that's a great opportunity. I will make an artist house." The next says, "Oh, I will make a CO2 neutral or an energy plus house." And you mobilize a lot of creativity and, I promise, a lot of additional money.
A small general comment on Professor Sutton's idea. I think when we are talking about the different approaches to urban development, and he has rightly pointed to, we are talking not about a unified perspective on urban progress, if one can talk about urban progress at all. There are different perspectives on this question, and I think what he rightly mentions is that there is a forgotten perspective, but I would not dichotomize, so to say, our perspectives in such a way. Let me pinpoint only to one question. When one is talking in the housing sector about the private development of housing and how that can be improved in the area, I think there are quite a number and a substantial number of approaches which could be taken up in Baltimore. For example, I do not know to which degree cooperative housing is, so to say, an element which is working or is not working, but cooperative housing could be supplied at a lower price than market rate to a certain degree, could integrate some of the social benefits of cooperation and self-determination, I might say, of people with it, and generate, for example, spillover effects for the area. And to a certain degree, although I might call HafenCity Hamburg an absolute top-down project with a lot of participatory elements, we have community housing projects which have had a tremendous positive impact on the social structure. And we allowed and pushed for that without the government pursuing that as a project, so to say, a little bit under the radar, as an important element to be integrated into an urban environment. So 20 households, for example, joining together and building a house with an advocacy planner and, for example, with someone who, from the more an NGO perspective of a developer, taking part of the risk. So I think it's not only looking at the existing, so to say, stakeholders in a certain way, the intelligent, the creative ones, which are, so to say, economically marginal, but look also at those which can be created and, so to say, generate a bridge in the urban economy. And there are different types of progress we must think about, and that in a global environment, in a city like Baltimore and also in Hamburg, we cannot only think from one perspective or the other.
A couple of things. I want to respect everyone's time, and I know you all have hung in there for a very long and I think very interesting series of questions and comments and presentations. A few kind of housekeeping items, shall we say, before we do a quick little Q&A. Number one, both IBA and HafenCity have brought various pamphlets and information on both of their projects, and that's over here to my left on the radiator there. So please feel free to help yourselves. We, and I'm springing this surprise on our panelists, but hopefully at least on the Downtown Partnerships website, we'll be able to host their presentations that were given today. We'll have to work through the details on that, but I'm sure those will be up within the next couple of days. Also, there is the Europe in Baltimore Facebook page, which has a lot of the information about the two developments, about kind of the presentations today, as well as the ongoing aspects of the grants that have been made between the organizations. And finally, the University of Maryland College Park, as part of this whole endeavor, has the IBA and HafenCity exhibit at the, I believe I'm pronouncing this, the Kibble Gallery, is that correct? And that, Kibble, Kibble's, it's Kibble. She says Kibble, he says Kibble. I don't know, we'll see. But anyway, it's in the gallery down at College Park. That runs through October 7th, and it's open 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. on weekdays. And that's part of the School of Architecture and Planning and Preservation. And you can, again, find the majority of that information on the Europe in Baltimore Facebook page. So please, use this as a resource, use this as a point of interest. I know our lovely panelists, both from Baltimore as well as from Hamburg, would be more than happy to, share their experiences with you if you're going to be in Hamburg, which, Jurgen and I have already talked about. I'm going to try and convince Kirby to, help pay my way to go see my former stomping grounds. Please, use them as a resource. This is a continual open dialogue, and BOPA has worked very hard, as well as the Bromo district and the other two arts and entertainment districts, to make this, conversation a possibility. So please use those. So with that, we have a very, unfortunately, limited time for questions. So if there are folks who would like to come up to the microphone at this time to ask any questions, please do so.
My name is Mark Oliver. I'm from the University of Maryland, Baltimore. I'd like to follow up on the suggestion of taking these 10 buildings on the Howard Corridor. Perhaps, Professor Stanton, with your experience, who would organize and be able to implement? We're talking, I think, about an implementation agency, the type of proposal that was just made, given the history in Baltimore of some of the projects, such as the project around Johns Hopkins, perhaps the more recent Harbor Point, perhaps the Superblock. Given what we know, is that possible? How could we do it? Who would be an enabler?
That's a almost impossible question to answer, because the obvious, the usual suspects would probably be unwilling to participate. Obviously, the city government, the municipality, which is this kind of central player, would be, because of, I suppose, liability issues and a lot of other things, would be unwilling, and financial issues, would be unwilling to do that, would rather spend time developing projects along the Inner Harbor or somewhere like that. One imagines that an agency could be established that would encourage this, probably use a mixture of public monies, maybe not even from this city, and that's another problem, is where monies come from in America, because here the municipalities are completely isolated, in a sense, financially, in a very different way than they would be in Germany. So, I mean, that's setting that up, and knowing how to, I mean, what we're doing again is saying, what is the top-down strategy that can encourage bottom-up activity, right? And that does have to be determined, of course. We can't just say, let's let grassroots go wherever they're going to go, right? We have to say, in a sense, how do we encourage them? How do we move and guide them, and so on? So, but I don't have an easy answer. I'm probably the last person actually on this panel to be able to answer that question.
I think I can maybe address that just to a very small extent, knowing, and again, kind of putting the disclaimer out there that things are very fluid, shall we say, and very much of a decision-making process for the Bromo Tower District, for the West Side. Unfortunately, Brenda's not here anymore. She had to leave for another commitment, but I think, obviously the Baltimore Development Corporation to date has really been the agency that is focused on that. We are discussing options, and when I say we, that's city government, that's the Baltimore Development Corporation as the development organization for the city, that's the Downtown Partnership, that's the Project Area Committee of stakeholders along the West Side. As well as my conversations with private developers, both those seated here and elsewhere, how do we make that happen, and how do we begin to be very bold as a city? Sitting around and waiting obviously has, shoot me if you want, but it has gotten us what we have today. And while we have some fabulous projects that have happened, the Hippodrome, the Everyman Theater, some great anchor institutions, the University of Maryland continues to be a tremendous asset, and the hospital as well. And we have great private development going on large scale. I think Wendy's very right. How do we address the smaller buildings? How do we encourage true commitment to the neighborhood by folks who, don't have the auspices to do a multi-million-dollar project, but have the auspices to maybe do a $2 million project? How do we work with the city and with BDC to really look at this area very differently than they have in the past and really start to make progress? Because everybody I walk through there says there's so much potential here, and I think everybody in this room obviously feels that and sees that. So how do we continue to make that happen? And just know that I don't have the answer to that right now. I have a lot of ideas, some wackier than others, but we are really, really pushing and working with the city to figure that out.
One historical point that wasn't spoken of is why Howard Street stopped being the fabulous center of Baltimore that it was. And of course, one of the reasons is the riots of 1968 and attendant fears that changed the city dramatically demographically. But the other, of course, was the development of the Inner Harbor and the emphasis on the part of the municipality to transfer all the energy and activity of the city to that safer place, I don't know, or more picturesque place, or whatever it was that was perceived to be. And of course, moving that energy and desire back to Howard Street to a certain extent. Inner Harbor obviously has its charms and its needs, but we continue to this point, 40 years later, to ignore most of the city in preference for that particular spot, right? And to continue to develop and ventilate financially and in planning initiatives on that one place. So that's another big problem which needs to be addressed.
Joan Weber, and I own a property. I'm part owner of a property on the northwest corner. It's a beautiful old bank building that was architected by Joseph Sperry, who I think did the Bromo Tower and a number of major buildings in Baltimore. And I've been listening very closely because we're facing a boarded up. We bought the building in 2006. We've had 2 tenants come and go since because they couldn't make a go of it, even though they invested money in building out the building. And so I've been listening very closely. And just the first point was, for me, when you talk top down, bottom up, if the city itself becomes a paralyzing agent on the development by boarding up a whole hub in the center of the city, in the center of the area you want to renovate, you want to revive, that becomes problematic to me. I'm from New York City, I'm from Washington, D.C., and I'm from Silver Spring, and I've witnessed in my lifetime some very radical, not gentrification only, but renovation of neighborhoods, and I've existed in those neighborhoods and lived in those neighborhoods. And a lot of it is done by, I would say, firemen and policemen, Columbia Heights in DC, done by teams of firemen and policemen, shift workers, who get 3 shifts to work 24/7. They buy a building, they rotate the shifts and get it done, get the buildings renovated very fast. So it's not, when the cities are boarded up, when the buildings are boarded up, then it's not a matter of simple uses. There can't be an approach of somebody who wants to just start a little cafe as a squatter. It doesn't happen, the boards are there. That's just problematic, that's a question. The second for me is the taxes in Baltimore are double anywhere else. The real estate taxes are literally double or more anywhere else in the state. I looked that up yesterday because of this panel. And since the tenants, it would be a single tenant building, would be paying twice the taxes or more in an area where they have half the traffic or a quarter of the traffic because they're facing a boarded up community. On top of which they pay an awning tax, they pay a light bulb under the awning tax, and they pay a special services tax. And the special services tax is for patrols because the area is not safe. So they're paying twice, I am, paying twice the taxes for police protection and city services, and then have to pay what is a 20% basically surtax for light bulbs, awnings, and which one would think would be an appropriate need in this community, and patrols. Not a question, just a statement of what does private development do. One of you had mentioned the idea of subsidizing retail as a top-down approach, and I'm thinking, I actually am working with my broker because we're trying to release the building. How would I compete with how could I possibly compete? I'm on the other side of the street from the boarded up community. How do I possibly compete with a commercial retail rent that has to meet a mortgage if we're talking about retail rents that are subsidized? The third point for me is the one that none of you have mentioned in this entire panel, and that was the one that the ULI report repeatedly said, and it was the bottom statement, if my memory serves, I read it quite a while ago, in their preface, which said if you don't solve the methadone clinic problem, you're not going to solve the West Side problem. And none of you addressed that. I've really tried to talk to a number of city folks, and I hear the number of 13 methadone clinics, and then I hear, oh no, there are only 2. But there are the people that are on the street, the undesirables, are not necessarily living in that community. They're not part of the residential group in that community. They are the people that come in and do deals and nod out on the street. That makes it not comfortable. Last, and this is a little bit snide, I don't mean to be snide, but I didn't understand when I got the notice of this meeting why this meeting with this audience and this group from the city government was not held on the West Side. The Everyman Theater is there. The city gave the Everyman Theater the theater for $1. So I can imagine the city would say, we need to use your auditorium for 3 hours, and it would not be a problem. And I don't understand why we were not invited as a community discussing the problem of the West Side, the issues and the development of the West Side, to take it seriously, because we all know you only show what you value by what you do. I've done it. I've invested my money, I've invested my resources, because I believed 7 years ago that even if the super block was not going to happen so fast, there was the energy of renovation and renewal. This group, and let me just say, this is what it is. The next meeting should be held, or can be held, or one might want to hold it, over in the West Side, in the community that you're looking to work with. Just some thoughts.
So I actually will try to go through and address each of your concerns and comments. Number one, on holding the panel discussion today on the West Side or in the Bromo District. Believe me, we certainly understand, and it would have been our ideal to have done that. Unfortunately, we had a very limited time frame, and we had very specific needs that had to be met. So, yes, again, ideally we'd love to, but there's also the German connection here, which we felt was as close of a second as we could come to. As for notification, et cetera, we try to involve the community, the Merchants Association, the individual merchants, those who live, work, and visit the West Side and the Bromo District as much as possible. I will say that as anybody who does anything with Main Streets District with small business owners and small property owners, it is hard to reach everyone, and we can only reach the people who want to be reached. The ULI report, so I'm going in reverse order here, the ULI report with the methadone clinics and with the issue of substance abuse and, shall we call it, entrepreneurial pharmaceutical sales on the West Side. Thank you. I cannot take credit for that. That is a friend of mine's comment, but she has it trademarked. The specific number of methadone clinics is not always necessarily an accurate one, and I think you've hit that nail on the head, and there are reasons for that. Number one is that there are certainly treatment facilities that don't run around reporting that they are methadone clinics. They can also just as easily be an Alcoholics Anonymous group or a Narcotics Anonymous group. Not every single group on the West Side and in the district certainly promote what they are and who they are. However, what we found, generally speaking, while there is a root of issue with substance abuse programs and supply of substance abuse treatment, the root is, it's not the root of what you see on the streets as being undesirable. It is certainly a small factor, but we feel very strongly that it's not the only factor. What we as a city and what we have as the Downtown Partnership have attempted to do, sometimes in waves and sometimes more consistently than at other times, is address the root of the issue. And quite frankly, the root of the issue is enforcement, as well as providing providing assistance. So the Downtown Partnership worked very closely with BSAS, the Baltimore Substance Abuse Systems, which is I believe, partially city run organization, partial city agency, where we had a full-time substance abuse counselor around Lexington Market, as well as dedicated police officers. As you can imagine, one of the issues is not just, okay, we're going to lock you up. We lock them up, they're back out within 24 hours, and they're back doing exactly what they were doing 24 hours ago, which is selling drugs to anybody they can sell drugs to. Providing substance abuse, sorry, I just totally lost my train of thought. Providing programs and getting people into those programs, you see a much lower rate of recidivism and of seeing those folks back out on the street. I don't have the numbers boiled into my brain, but I certainly can get those to anyone who wants them, of the number of folks we were able to reach and actually provide long-term services for, not hey, we're going to get you in detox and then you're back out here, but in actual long-term housing, long-term substance abuse programs. And that has been very successful and is something that we continue to support, both from the Downtown Partnership side as well as the city agencies' support thereof. We've done a variety of enforcement with the University of Maryland's police, with the Lexington Market Police, with the Baltimore City Police, as well as the, Brian, who am I forgetting, the MTA? Maryland Transit Authority, to really target and hone in on some of the issues that we see. I will be the first to admit I don't like to drive up and down Utah Street simply because of the jaywalking. We did a very targeted enforcement with the mounted patrol, the horse-mounted patrol from Baltimore City, and really saw success out of that. Now, unfortunately, they are a very small part of the city police department and can't be there all of the time. I think you will find, as Tom Stoser mentioned earlier, with the market and what we're looking to do with the market and how we're looking to transform the market, it's not an overnight process by any stretch, but the attitude about how the market functions in and of itself, as well as a part of a neighborhood, has to change. And the perception of that market will only change when when a large portion of its physical presence changes and its ability to actually engage the street instead of being completely an internal scary, seemingly scary place because you don't know what goes on behind those doors once you step into the market. It needs to be turned inside out, and that's really something, we need to look at as we address this long-term planning. Is it too large? Is it providing enough of a diversity of foods, services, et cetera, and what it needs to provide for the neighborhood? The mayor has made it very clear that a large portion of the Baltimore population, particularly those from west of Martin Luther King, the neighborhoods west of MLK, do use the market as their primary source of fresh fruits, vegetables, meats, etc. We need to continue to provide that. We do have large city food deserts in this city, and we need to be able to continue to provide the services that Lexington Market provides. There is absolutely no reason that those services need to be provided in any less than a completely quality environment, and they are not currently provided in a quality environment. There's absolutely no reason for those of us who are working so hard on the market feel that the market should be anything less than the quality of a Reading Terminal Market in Philadelphia or an Eastern Market in Detroit. We have every possibility of making that happen, and I think you'll find that the mayor is very committed to that. And certainly Downtown Partnership and other organizations that are involved are committed to that. As for the taxes, I don't control the property taxes, unfortunately, but I know the mayor certainly has her goals of what she'd like to see happen with that. The special benefit tax district that you mentioned is the Downtown Management Authority tax. That money provides the services that you see with the folks cleaning the streets. We have about 50 folks out every single day cleaning the streets. We have, round the clock, and we have about 50 folks throughout the day who are out there being tour guides, being extra eyes and ears for the police. These are services that the city absolutely would not be able to provide. That's why we were started to begin with. It also, quite frankly, pays for, the salaries of those of us who are out in that section of town and throughout downtown every single day, reviewing legislation, working with the merchants, working with Dominic and Wendy, working with folks who want to invest their money here. So Believe me, I understand taxes. I don't want to pay them either, but, it is part of the extra service that's provided. And then finally, I just kind of want to address both the first question and then your questions as well about the city's, the boarded properties and how paralyzing that is. And believe me, that's something I think everyone in this room can absolutely agree to. It doesn't give you a lot of confidence and faith that anything's going to happen when you see boarded up properties. One of the things the partnership did in conjunction with BDC was actually try to, at least at a bare minimum, create a uniform look along throughout the district by creating, their black plywood, they're painted black. If somebody puts graffiti on them, they get painted right back over. Is that lipstick on a pig? Absolutely, I get that. Is the partnership in a position to continue to work with the city and to continue to push the city to put the properties into productive use? Believe me, my team and I and all of us at the partnership are pushing that every single day. We work with folks like Dominic and Wendy, some others in the audience, and others throughout the city who are so interested in those properties, and we'll continue to do that. As I mentioned before, we're figuring out kind of the best way to make that happen. So I know you and I have talked before, and I think we need to kind of regroup and touch base again. Other questions? Sure.
My name's Richard Lehman. I do urban revitalization and transportation planning, but I'm here as a writer, and I live in DC and have paid attention to Baltimore for 20 years. And today I walked here from Penn Station, and everybody in this room knows Charles Street today does not look like what it did 10 years ago. I was shocked to see comparatively speaking, a handful of vacancies. And it didn't used to be that way. And year by year, there's been a significant improvement, which should leave us hopeful for Howard Street. But, and I'm a little out of date on some of the latest initiatives in Baltimore, but I've always been struck by what other people have talked about it, but the very much top-down focus of Baltimore. If you read the Baltimore Master Plan, it's unique in that it has an element on history, but it's so proud of urban renewal. You're so proud of your big projects. And like Professor Stanton mentioned about the Inner Harbor, and I understand the Inner Harbor and Harbor Point and Canton, because some people want to live in new stuff. And they're not gonna fix a building on Howard Street. It took me decades to accept that, but some people want new stuff. But there hasn't been a capture of the learning and about the necessity of the bottom up. And until, in cities, municipalities, states are really good, and even probably downtown partnerships, because basically the property owners dictate what you do. I'm a close critic and analyst of the bids in DC. So the thing is you haven't captured the learning to deal with block by block, building by building improvements. And it's not easy, it's really hard, especially when you're a weak market, when you have all these people wanting to pump money into Inner Harbor and Canton and everywhere else, when, a normal person in this field should be paralyzed by thinking about all the vacant properties in the city and how to capture them. But it is happening. Station North today, compared to 15 years ago, unbelievable. Charles Street, same thing. And the point made about the 3 districts of the Bromo district, the 3 sub-districts, well, I see these, the whole core of the city is coming together. But in this meeting, I see not so much focused on individual property owners on Howard Street, but on city stakeholders that in the BDC, which, HafenCity, they have this whole idea of the civic in their top-down initiative, whereas BDC had to be sued in order to even provide information about their meetings before the current director. So this city has so much energy and opportunity in life compared to DC, which I think of as antiseptic. But we're lucky we have the steady employment engine of the federal government. But if you don't capture this learning in a renewed focus on the ground up, in the hope, like Ms. Blair said about the big project, and if the mega project falls through, then you've lost 10 years. And you have 10 more years till the next big project. Anyway, I see hope in the opportunity maybe that you'll capture this idea of the ground up. And for example, I'm just going to give an example because the gentleman and Wendy mentioned this. In DC, I'm a preservationist. Our preservation group says, well, we don't have a local historic preservation tax credit. In DC, you don't need it because the buildings are going to be rehabbed anyway. And I said, but we do need it for the small buildings. You know, a 150,000 square foot building, it can get $5 to $10 million in historic preservation tax credits. A project under $2 million isn't even worth doing almost for at least syndicating the credits. And nobody here mentioned new markets, tax credits. I don't know if you use them and pair them. But anyway, I'm going to get out of line. But that's, again, an area you guys have a lot to offer in terms of refiguring these opportunities for changing the planning regime and the taxing regime, et cetera, if you capture the learning, and I don't see it yet.
My name is Renee Eisenbach. I'm an architecture professor at University of Maryland, College Park. And I wanted to shift the conversation a little bit because I feel like we have this tremendous opportunity that was given to us by the projects that were shown to us by our two guests. IBA and HafenCity are projects in which they were successful in acknowledging the complexity of all the issues that are involved in redeveloping a city area, bringing together the different kinds of stakeholders and people necessary to do that, and setting up a structure that allowed that to go forth in an innovative way as well. And then underscoring that is also thinking about the transformation of value of the land that was in place and how that increased value, particularly thinking about Jurgen gave a good example of that, but we also see that in IBA, gets plowed back into the community in the form of infrastructure and green space. That model, I think, is, you know, in a certain way, it's hard to believe it's in the same world that we live in, to think about how that could be applied here. Yet it was accomplished. And that makes me wonder what of that we can take. And so forgive me for not being so familiar with Baltimore. Is the Red Line project going down Howard Avenue? Is it anywhere near there?
Lombard Street.
Okay. It's crossing it. So certainly that's something big that we know is going to happen that changes it. And it's going to increase the values of the area. And so I'm just, you know, again, I don't know this area very well, but that notion of realizing that increased value, that money shouldn't just be going to the people who are investing. It should be in some way part of the development process, but it also should be used to plow back into the infrastructure and into creating green space. Because if I have heard nothing else, it's that sense of the larger plan that helps make it more possible for developers to reduce risk and to increase the value in the neighborhood. That is really what we would really need to do. So I want to thank people for that.
Thank you.
Hello? Yeah. I think there's a little bit of a problem in believing that the Red Line is going to change everything. We heard that my students and I worked in Harlem Park last.
I mean to say that it was going to change everything. I was just trying to say some piece in which there's public investment.
Maybe you didn't mean it, but other people have said this so many times, that this thing is going to kind of alter, especially in discussing Harlem Park, the immediate West Baltimore, extraordinarily problematic parts of immediate West Baltimore, which are really one stop away from downtown. You could easily walk from there, in fact. we've had the light rail's been in place for 15 years, and Westport is still Westport, and Cherry Hill is still Cherry Hill. Neighborhoods that it touched did not suddenly magically become fabulous. And that's something we have to realize. There's much more to it than one piece of transportation infrastructure.
Absolutely, Michael.
Yeah, you know that. But,
we worked together on that. But I guess the more important point was thinking about this issue of investment and planning green space and trying to figure out a way to tackle all the issues together.
One more point is that, when people come from abroad, they look at our environment and see things we have forgotten are there or become used to. And my colleagues here brought up 2 points. One is the one that we spoke briefly about, the widening of the sidewalks and the problem that it doesn't allow, for instance, freight drop-off at storefronts along Howard Street and what happens there. And that was a very good point. The other was every time they saw one of these new housing developments with a wall around it or a fence, and they were just appalled. I think I can say that, right? Okay. They were appalled and said, that's not urban. You can't do this. What is going on here? The housing is gated. It's closed. It's defensive. And, of course, that's something to think about, right? That we just normally assume. The solution to the problem of downtown is to build gated communities, compounds in the city when we do residential ones. I don't think that's true of Wendy's place, actually. So, but of others we saw, it was definitely true. So anyway, enough.
And I do apologize. We actually need to completely wrap up, and I certainly encourage anyone to continue the conversations amongst individuals, but we do have to give this space back, and I do know that others have to be elsewhere, so I apologize. I'm very sorry, but please do continue the conversations, and thank you again very much for coming.